Opening speech by President Ahmed Sékou Touré at the international seminar jointly organized in Conakry from November 18 to 20, 1982, by the Democratic Party of Guinea and the World Peace Council on African resistance to colonial intrusion. Africa, like other continents of the world, has its own history, a history woven from events that have characterized the constantly dynamic behavior of its sons and daughters, and the peoples who have formed there to perpetuate human life by valuing nature. Modern anthropology has established that Africa is the cradle of the human species. Africa is therefore the continent that saw humans organize their human life, conquer their survival, which is the first form of resistance to any destruction or extinction of the species, at the very moment they opened a human eye to nature. Our researchers should dwell on this point, which seems crucial to us, for how can we not admit that a millennia-old tradition of resistance by the people of Africa could not have weighed in the struggle they had to carry on even into modern times? How can we not see that these peoples of Africa were predisposed, thanks to their astonishing capacity to resist any form of arbitrary power, any form of aggression or oppression acquired through the ages, to also survive two of the most serious and tragic violences in history, the slave trade and colonialism? It means that the peoples of Africa, like other peoples, showed sufficient vitality and creative genius. They built viable societies which, over a long historical process, through successive approaches, sometimes conflictual, even brutal and bloody, sometimes through peaceful alliances, merged into clan, tribal, national collectivities. The peoples of Africa, our peoples, used their intelligence and all their physical and moral faculties to constantly and effectively act on nature, which they continuously transformed to meet their needs and constantly improve their living conditions. Our peoples, like other peoples, therefore ensured, autonomously, their material life, their social, cultural, and spiritual life. They created intellectual means and implemented communication practices, communication of ideas, communication of means. They created cultural languages, made works of art, economic exchanges, and created and used techniques and technologies appropriate to their activities and means of production. They determined and organized modes of behavior, internal discipline in each society, with the hierarchy of values that founded this society, ethics and aesthetics. They built material infrastructures, developed rules governing human behavior, in short, the way of communal existence, rules of justice to ensure security and social harmony. These rules for administering the collective property of the family, clan, tribe, or nation. These norms of behavior or conduct are obvious characteristics of the existence of an African consciousness, an African culture, an African civilization. The peoples of Africa, over many millennia, therefore evolved within a framework of total independence from the peoples living on other continents, who themselves also, through their own actions, realized their societies, developed their material and immaterial heritage, having achieved at some point in their history more advanced scientific and technical conquests in certain fields, including that of destruction. Nations from other continents could impose their influence on African nations, first through contacts made possible by the nascent practice of navigation, barter trade, and then through domination, precisely because of the superiority of the material force possessed by the European invaders. Pre-colonial Africa, which was experiencing vertical evolution and exercising its sovereignty over its own affairs, had to endure the will of foreign powers that imposed themselves by material force, trampling on the legitimate rights of our peoples to live freely and with dignity on their continent. But having been able to live a life without reference to external values, having organized its existence on its own basis for millennia, Africa could not kneel before intruders. It could only resort to the resources that allowed it to make its history, instead of laying down its arms before invaders driven by the instinct of gain. Thus, it is the will to be the authentic expression of oneself that led, in all African countries, to resistance against colonialism, that is, a consciously resolved opposition to any foreign domination. Talking about African resistance means situating the resolute behavior of our peoples in the face of any attack on their personality, any violence perpetrated against their sovereignty, and any practice aimed at rendering the African irresponsible and unworthy in their existence. Talking about African resistance also means portraying the peoples of Africa in their struggle to fully assume their own identity and ensure the preservation and continuous development of their heritage, both material and immaterial. Talking about African resistance means finally having our peoples take charge of the legitimacy of their aspirations to effectively exercise their historical responsibilities and their will to be and to become according to their exclusive choice. Resistance to oppression is the realization of a people's will to exercise by all means its inalienable right to revolt against arbitrariness, tyranny, servitude, and misery. It means that all historical eras have known this drama and will know it again as long as a power, a system of force, or a group of men arrogates to itself the right to impose its law within a conscious and responsible national society, or on an entire conscious and determined people to defend its sovereignty and dignity. Any power that violates the right of humans and peoples to live in dignity is a usurpation, for a people never consciously gives up this faculty or force that it alone possesses, the force to guarantee the permanence of its social and political system by endowing it with the seal of its legitimacy and legality. In speaking of African resistance, we do not intend to strip a universal phenomenon of its character by geographically limiting its manifestations, but we believe that in the case of Africa, resistance took on a character that distinguishes it in several aspects, the main one being the violent subjugation of its populations to the most abject practices in human history. First, the slave trade making black people a raw material, ebony wood, a mere object of commerce and its historical culmination, the depopulation of Africa, which lost about 2/3 of its active population, then foreign domination on the continent itself, aimed at the total loss of identity, the annihilation of any will to resist indignity, and this on a continental scale. It happens that the proponents of this organized execution of African people have never had the privilege of understanding that one of history's characteristics is to judge human actions according to the essence of their impact on human and societal existence. Europe ventured into colonization through a process that inevitably strikes any civilization that develops vertically, while disregarding the just necessity of horizontally associating broad social layers in sharing the wealth created in common. And the more such an ethic becomes systematic in global development, the more artificial privileges become natural in people's minds. A superiority complex, skill in legitimizing arbitrariness, disdain for other peoples, overreach beyond territories to subject them to exploitation and hegemony. Thus, oppression leads to the dehumanization of both the colonizer and the colonized. Some still speak of the stimulating effects of colonization for the populations, colonization which, in the eyes of an eminent man from the mid-19th century, is adorned with all virtues. His country, he writes, is composing a magnificent poem titled The Colonization of Africa. His country, he continues, resorts to war only insofar as it is necessary for civilization. What reassures his country is knowing that it brings light and freedom in its hand. His country knows that for a savage people, being occupied is to begin to be free, that for a city of barbarians, being brutalized is the beginning of enlightenment. For his country, making war, invading territories, and bombing fortifications is not important if it silences its guns with books. Ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers, you have heard light and freedom for a savage people, burning of barbarian cities, as the beginning of enlightenment, invasion of territories, marriage of guns and books. Then you will agree with us that it is significant that this seminar on African resistance coincides with the 13th National Festival of Arts and Culture in Guinea. It is because resistance to subjugation is also a cultural manifestation, and such treatment of the human condition can only trigger a resistance all the more fierce as it concerns people conscious of the fact that their peoples were never deprived of freedom for centuries, peoples who even ignored the existence of invaders' civilizations. We have been saying for nearly 15 years that history teaches us quite clearly that any element of progress, whether technical, scientific, social, or cultural, has real human value only if its influence serves the entire universal society and constitutes an honest means of evolution. But the guns and books we just mentioned were identical to the first wharfs of Gorée, the loose islands of Conakry, the docks of Bouquet, Benti, Dubreka, Bassam, Elmina, built to facilitate the slave trade, and which necessarily called for the exercise of the right to resist, to humiliation, to foreign domination, to oppression, and to indignity. To build their empire on the ruins of African peoples, the colonizers resorted to the military occupation of vast territories under the absolute control of the metropolis. To govern the world without sharing was and remains the prerogative of a stifling system that stifles itself by its own vertical development. A system that, through its exported capital, institutes a monopoly that seeks to be global in order to procure super profits at the expense of the freedom of others, if not their mere existence. To this system of boundless oppression and exploitation of peoples and men, to this systematic plunder of their territories, to the organized theft of their goods to secure an easy and free market, Africans could only oppose resistance in all its forms. For the sake of their cause, to appease their conscience, the invaders did not lack contemptuous qualifiers, pretending to tarnish the credibility of the heroes we legitimately speak of today. Legitimately, because, as they say, to know where you are going, you must know where you come from. The memory of peoples is an inexhaustible source of experiences and courage to face the future and its complex problems successfully. But let's listen to some of their more courteous remarks. Abdel Kader of Algeria, insolent and stubborn Berber, El Hajj Umar Tall, fanatical and turbulent Marabout, Behenzin of Dahomey, a barbarian, a human blood drinker, the Mahdi of Sudan, a pun on his name, Mad Maula, the enraged chief, Almami Samari Touré, bloodthirsty petty king and slave trader. And we could go on with the crude insults and labels attached to our resistors by those who cynically carved up Africa like game at the sad conference of Berlin in 1884, 1885. But our heroes of resistance to colonial occupation could only be insulted by vile souls. At an opportune moment in history, they had the will and courage to categorically say no to the foreigner's diktat, no to shame, no to the shackles of slavery, no to submission to a vile order, and to affirm his refusal to accept any compromise with the enemies of his people. Almami Samari Touré rightly said, as one of our historians reports, "When a man does not want something, he says no categorically and unequivocally." A sufficient step back in the past to grasp the political motives, ideological motivations, and moral springs that drove men into the path of an all-out struggle for dignity and freedom allows for a solid perception of the inevitable complexity of future issues. Almami Samari Touré, whose empire is one of the sub-themes of this international seminar on African resistance to colonial intrusion, Almami Samari Touré, we say, was one of the greatest resistors to French colonial invasion in Africa. He began his life in the trade of plant products and livestock, within a family tradition, his father having engaged in the same activities. It was the capture of his beloved mother by the Cissé troops that led this man to enlist in the same troops to secure his mother's release. He demonstrated exceptional military qualities, indomitable courage, and firm determination in combat, and thus gradually became influential. Embodying noble aspirations for the political unity of his tribe's villages, he formed an autonomous troop to establish a domain that he expanded with each conquest. He was an astute diplomat, a true strategist in defining a line of conduct, and a skillful tactician whose keen sense of the surrounding context allowed him to make the most accurate decisions immediately. He formed several alliances with the chiefs of the Manding region and managed to rally the populations of the current regions of Bela, Karawane, Kankan, Mandiana, Siguri, Kurausa, Farana, etc. A great organizer, he instilled discipline in his troops and set up a judicious administration and a perfect organization of his territory. He skillfully applied the method of decentralization in this administration, decentralization associated with the concentration of power, particularly military, judicial, religious, and educational, for his goal was above all to create a homogeneous and powerful nation subject to the morals of Islam, a religion he practiced and whose expansion he worked for. But just as he was building a national entity, the invading French troops departing from Senegal advanced towards Niger with the intention of subjecting the Manding sub-region to French authority. At the same time, British troops were conquering the south of Sierra Leone and establishing English trading posts. For 18 years, from 1881 to 1898, the Samorian Empire faced violent and continuous attacks from French troops. Almami Samori Touré had to resort, in the context of resistance to any foreign colonization, to great mobility of his troops and guerrilla warfare. He stubbornly refused any abdication despite the superiority of the deadly weapons used by the enemy. It was following a betrayal, and by surprise that on September 29, 1898, he was arrested and deported to Gabon with his son Sarankemori Touré. Almami Samori Touré, whose personality your seminar will highlight, will magnify the work of unifying the Manding populations and pay tribute to his courage, intelligence, patriotic determination, and high qualities as a mass leader and army chief, was an exceptional man in the history of Guinea, a man whose prestige covered the entire African continent to such an extent that his sworn enemies were led to say and write about him, that of all the African sovereigns, kings, emperors, and chiefs, he was the most courageous and determined in defending his homeland. These are some of the characteristics marking Almami Samori Touré, whom some colonialists dared to smear with their venom. What is true is that any resistance was considered a crime against civilization. What is also true is that there are legions of resistors to colonial subjugation. What is true is that not a single square meter of our lands was occupied without resistance. We just talked about Almami Samori Touré, but how can we resist the temptation to recall the memory of some other prestigious resistors? Without leaving Guinea, how can we not associate with the exemplary struggle led by Almami Samori Touré, the one led by Alpha Yaya Diallo, who died in exile in Mauritania, who defended the northwest zone of Guinea, those led by the valiant troops of Bokar Biro Bari, Sebela Togba, Dina Salifu, the Waliu of Gomba, Kisi Kaba, Bakari Touré, who died in exile in Madagascar, Queen Nyara Belli, all of whom were of the category of those men who accepted to face all trials, so that their names would never be associated with capitulation. But let's step out of Guinea for a moment. Everywhere there was struggle. One of the illustrious resistors to colonial domination was the Senegalese religious leader Cheikh Amadou Bamba, 1850–1927. Cheikh Amadou Bamba, on a spiritual level, was one of the great leaders of the Muslim populations of Senegal. He was the founder of the religious movement called Mouridism. Cheikh Amadou Bamba provided Muslim education and taught Islamic morals in its dual individual and social foundation. Work as an obligation for man, justice as the basis of social harmony, tolerance, decency, and generosity as qualities of the faithful religious, were the privileged foundation of popular education he disseminated without restriction. This fervent Muslim, considered by the colonial administration as a danger to its perpetuity, was arbitrarily arrested and deported to Gabon, where he found the one he rightly considered his friend, his companion on the road, and with whom he shared the heavy mission of Islamization in the western sub-region of our continent, Almami Samori Touré. Fate led him to witness the physical disappearance of this great friend, and it was he who led the prayer over his body before his burial in the land of the Njole Island. Cheikh Amadou Bamba, this Muslim ascetic, was also separated from his people and the world during an exile that lasted 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Released in 1902, after the death of Ahmed Sékou Touré, he returned to Senegal. The colonial authorities commanding the TS Circle tried in vain to obtain from him the renunciation of his religious activities and tried, through false accusations of child abductions, to lay hands on him again. The great popularity of this saint man, who embodied the martyrdom of Islam, forced the colonial power to abandon this attempt at crime and surround him with respect and consideration to avoid the uprising of the Senegalese populations. The resistance of the Senegalese people to colonial intrusion was, in fact, embodied by several great figures, due to the fact that Senegal, on the West African Atlantic facade, served as a starting point for French colonial troops towards the African hinterland. Here we must mention the glorious pages written, at the cost of their blood, by resistors like Lat Dior Diop, 1842-1886, who compared himself to a bow that one keeps bending without breaking. He was a valiant free man who liked to say, "I want to live with dignity and generosity." Perceptive, Lat Dior understood well the economic concerns of the invaders. The Dakar-St. Louis Railway was for him the enemy troops' transport route. It was despite his will that the French built it. Beside him are Lamine Dramé, Albouri Ndiaye, who held the invaders at bay. At a time when divisions are lurking, let's consider the value of the alliances Lat Dior and Albouri Ndiaye forged for the defense of their land. Lat Dior Amadou Sékou, Lat Dior Albouri, Albouri Amadou Sékou. In Mali, it was Babemba who opposed the French, and when French artillery overpowered his fortress of Sikasso, he preferred to commit suicide rather than surrender. It was May 1, 1898. In Sierra Leone, Queen Mama Yoko wrote a vibrant page of courage in her fierce resistance to British invasion troops. In Upper Volta, the valiant Naba Wogbo first faced the column of Lieutenants Voulet and Chanoine on September 1, 1896. In Dahomey, it was Béhanzin who, in adversity, in the misfortune of arms against the incomparably better-equipped French colonial troops, already said, "Defeat is only a failure in history if the courage in combat bequeaths to the successors the determination to continue the struggle until victory." We must preserve the lives of those who remain, because we know that after generations, after times of submission, humiliation, and oblivion, the country will be restored, standing because men will have kept safe what must be kept. In Tunisia, Ali Pasha, 1740-1756, and Hamouda Bey, 1782-1814, showed fierce determination in defending their homeland. As we can see, our peoples never accepted subjugation. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo, which spanned both sides of the Congo River and included the current republics of Zaire, Congo, and Angola, illustrates this fact. Opposition to European colonial invasion troops manifested not only in secret societies, whether secular or not, but also in large religious movements formed from Christian missions or modeled on them. The Messianic movements. There, one witnessed total reactions to political conditions, the unequal nature of social relations, and a missionary action that compromised itself with the colonial design. These movements, essentially political, also reflected the need then felt by Africans to have a religion of their own. We can cite Ana Nzinga, 1623-1663, Chimpa Vila alias Dona Beatriz, 1702, Simon Kibangu, 1889-1951, Matsina, 1889-1942. Wherever we turn in Africa, we encounter illustrious figures of resistors. In Tanganyika, resistance to German intrusion was led by Mkwawa, 1891-1898. Feeling exhausted, he chose death over servitude. In Ghana, the symbol of resistance to colonial penetration was Queen Yu Asantewa. She was exiled to the Seychelles with her entire family. In Sudan, Mohammed Ahmed Abdallah revealed himself as a holy man who announced, to end European injustices and abuses, that he was the awaited Mahdi at the end of time to establish the reign of justice. He then engaged in the struggle for his country's liberation from European yoke. His dazzling victory in 1881 electrified the masses and rapidly expanded his forces. Mohammed Ahmed Abdallah went on the offensive and crushed German, British, and Italian troops. Soon, a wholly colonialist alliance emerged to end this flare-up of patriotic exploits that deeply threatened the combined European interests throughout the sub-region. At the same time, in neighboring Ethiopia, Menelik II, 1889–1913, rightly considered one of the greatest figures of the 19th century in Africa, had a deep understanding of the course of history. He thought in terms of progress for Ethiopia. He is the father of the modernization of the continent's oldest kingdom. He abolished slavery and mandated compulsory education. But above all, he led a tough resistance struggle with a troop of 70,000 men, powerfully armed, and brimming with patriotism against the colonial intrusion troops of 3 European powers, Italy, England, and France. He asserted, driven by a firm will, "I will not watch arms folded as powers from across the sea come with the intention of sharing Africa." He would inflict a crushing defeat on the Italians at Adwa. This victory of Menelik II resounded in Europe like a thunderclap in a clear sky and put Ethiopia on the international map. If we leap from Menelik II's Ethiopia to Nigeria, we will see that long before Menelik II, Usman Dan Fodio, 1754–1817, honored Africa with his fierce resistance to English colonialism, and also because this eminent scholar was a saint in the Maliki rite. Thanks to his piety and personal prestige, Usman Dan Fodio undertook to establish a just and enlightened power based on the precepts of the Holy Quran. The super-tribal empire he aspired to create would have succeeded if it hadn't been for the fierce opposition of the English colonial authorities. Already, African unity, the union of the peoples of Africa, was seen by colonial powers as the supreme danger. Ladies and gentlemen, comrades, we must resist the temptation to name all the African resistors that crowd our memory. Abdelkader in Algeria, Abdelkrim in the Rif, and Mohammed Fiv, all in Morocco, Queen Ranavalona III in Madagascar, Shaka of the Zulu Kingdom. No, we cannot name them all, you who make us proud and give us the courage to continue. But we must always remember, not to mourn our glorious resistors, not to lament, for revolutionaries do not weep for their heroes fallen on the field of immortality. They do not merely avenge them either. Revolutionaries act as the continuators of the fallen heroes. We want to be and remain their continuators. They resisted colonial subjugation, rightly convinced that without national sovereignty nothing is possible, that without the responsibility of man and the people that only freedom can establish, nothing worthwhile can be built, that without dignity that only flourishes on the ground of free thought, there is no place for authenticity. And it is because the peoples of Africa understood this message from our illustrious African resistors that they formed themselves into permanent liberation movements, first to regain the sovereignty stolen, then to cleanse themselves of all stains, to rid themselves of all the remnants of domination and oppression, and to engage in the path of continental unity and socio-cultural and economic development, drawing both from the pre-colonial past, from the bitter experience gained in the depths of the colonial night, as well as from the knowledge mastered through interaction with others. We must follow the example of the African resistors who, in historical periods when the exercise of power, obeying the objective laws of social evolution, was tribal or feudal, therefore highly personalized, were able to shed all the blinding individual subjectivities of this type of power, to embrace the cause of their peoples, to identify with them at the cost of their lives. Our resistors managed to insert their personal equation into their people's struggle, and thus achieve, for and in the resistance struggle, a total democracy of combat. When the dream that nourishes the actors of the past is the advent of a world of responsibility for each man in taking charge of the common future, the past cannot be outdated. Its lines of force become permanent over time as long as the object of the dream is not materialized in reality. Indeed, African resistors, like all other resistors, not only identified in the heat of action this object, namely freedom, but they also had a clear awareness of the necessity to regain it. This awareness might have been lacking, but it was not, which is why our current struggle is the continuation of their struggle. This means that here, there is no question of a break between the present and the future we aspire to, but of materializing the project of the past. We can affirm that our struggle for the advent of a completely de-alienated Africa is not new. We can affirm that we, the living, did not initiate an unprecedented action, but that we have committed ourselves, and must do so, to seek ways and means to concretize a task, a program from the past in a conscious manner, to establish the order of human dignity. Africa, we have said, is a continent where invaluable human values exist, not yielding in any way to the values to which in other continents of the world peoples remain deeply attached. However, Africa has been labeled the continent of savages, the continent of uncultured people. These insults, these untruths, were advanced and propagated only to justify a rapacious greed to seize the wealth of a peaceful continent that has never attempted to extend its authority or spread it beyond its own borders, but that has always known how to effectively deal with the internal contradictions that arise and develop in any social entity. We do not want to idealize Africa. We are not idealists. We do not want to retreat into ourselves either, far from it, because we know that interdependence, reciprocal contributions, now form the basis of relations from people to people, country to country, continent to continent. But we want, and it is the role of historians, especially African historians, to restore historical truth. This is a program but also a requirement. Africa, we have said, has never accepted foreign domination, submission, and indignity. It has always shown courage in its daily struggle against hostile nature. It has always known how to create and maintain a specific way of life, adapted to the environment it constantly tries to adjust to the permanent demands of its life. But any harmony is quickly disrupted as soon as a foreign element infiltrates. Colonial intrusion, whatever one says, remains the element that fundamentally disturbed African life, African evolution. Africa, we have said, has never accepted subjugation. This is why, although momentarily beaten by brute force due to the enemy's technical superiority, it has never considered itself defeated. It had certainly lost a battle, that of material weapons, rifles, and cannons, but it was assured of winning the war, that of history, which, as we like to say, is not a sprint, but a long-distance race that is not measured by the life of a man, but by that of peoples who remain. History is indeed on that scale, and not another. And because it has never considered itself defeated, Africa, having faith in its enduring values and the bright future that awaits them, chose, during the colonial eclipse, to take refuge in its imperishable values. The cocoon containing our intact cultural and civilizational values was to open to Africa and the world, to deliver a message of fraternity and peace, a message of solidarity. Reinstalled in its dignity, having recovered its personality and identity, Africa intends to safeguard and consolidate them, while positively contributing to the general progress of humanity. African resistance to colonial penetration. This is a fact that history attests to. Here again is the riff, a symbol of the struggle for independence. General Lyautey, the banker, engages in provocations because this riff was simply rich in minerals. Finally, in 1924, the riff is surrounded, its inhabitants victims of organized famine. Abdel Krim organizes the fight with remarkable boldness and intelligence. "We are accused," he wrote to the French Parliament, "of being rebels, but we fight for our country. We are accused of choosing war for pastime, but such slanders do not stand up to scrutiny. We proclaim our desire to live in peace and develop our country's resources for the benefit of its inhabitants." A people who produces such heroes will always do so whenever historical circumstances demand it. It produced a Mohammed V, who also set an example of tenacity against colonial pressures. He was aware that the cause he defended was not that of a throne, but that of a people rich in strong traditions of freedom. History was to reward his resistance to all solicitations and his courage in the face of all abuses. We speak of African resistance to colonial penetration, but always from the angle of military technological differences. These differences are a fact that history attests to. The emphasis has been unilaterally placed on armed resistance. The phenomenon has generally been viewed from the angle of arms, of free battles. It has generally been very little approached from the cultural angle. Yet culture is the very foundation, the essential reason, the origin, the explanation, the justification for the armed struggle against colonial penetration, or, if it has already taken place, to drive the invaders out of the illegally occupied territory. It is because our peoples knew how to preserve our cultures intact, with their multiple facets and diverse expressions, that today, having gained independence and full sovereignty, we can show dignity and personality. It is thanks to this culture that we assert our identity. However, the entire people had to preserve their culture for us to speak today of a return to the sources. If, on the level of armed resistance, one can speak of the organization of an army, of global strategy and appropriate tactics, of a war chief, of a hero, even if the whole action is always led by the people. On the other hand, on the cultural level, you have no heroes, you have no chief. It is the entire people who fully assume their eminent function as vigilant, firm, and resolute guardians of their culture, the one they secrete daily through and through their activities, but also the one that qualifies and consolidates their activities. Culture is therefore essentially, even exclusively, a social fact. The liberation struggle, as we have said, is an act of culture. It is in the name of a culture, a cultural identity, that one takes up arms to defend one's own personality, which one posits as different from that of the other, the occupier. Here, the other is my antithesis. He is the one who denies me, but whose existence my affirmation also denies, hence an implacable, necessary struggle. This struggle, resulting from resistance to the pressure of the occupier who wants to annihilate me in my existence and being, can take on, and does take on, several forms, all having the same spring, the preservation of personality, and the same objective, the affirmation of cultural identity. It can indeed take the form of armed struggle, as is the case in some African countries that had no other choice but this path. It can take the form of political struggle, the organization of the people, their political and ideological education, their permanent mobilization around the defense of their independence, thus leading the colonizer to be in flagrant contradiction with himself every day, and to make this contradiction explode in full view. What he loudly proclaims is not what he practices. He will then want to prove to the world that what he says is what he does. The shot is fired. It can no longer be caught. This was the case with the Gaullist referendum of 1958 in Guinea. Today, some ill-advised theorists try to establish a difference in degree, even in nature, between these two forms of national liberation struggle. They believe that the countries that liberated themselves through armed struggle have more merit than those that liberated themselves, thanks to the political genius of their peoples. This is a new maneuver by imperialism to divide countries of the same front, weaken them, destabilize them, and bring them down. Particular attention must be paid to this false theory to combat it. Imperialism did not act differently during colonial penetration. It flattered some, threatened others, constantly pitting them against each other so that they would weaken each other before becoming its easy prey. The culture that was our refuge and allowed us to rehabilitate ourselves today will remain our privileged weapon. It was in the name of Islamic culture that Almami Samori Touré fiercely opposed French colonial penetration for 18 years. We also know that colonialism did everything to annihilate the colonized by imposing its culture on them, and making them lose even their personality. This is why culture remains a privileged field of resistance to colonial penetration. If we have insisted on highlighting this other aspect of African resistance, it is to indicate the full value of culture, its importance in our people's lives. You understand more the reason that led us to coincide the seminar on African resistance with the 13th National Festival of Arts and Culture, because to reach us in our being and then objectify us forever, colonialism targeted our culture, which it tried to annihilate. That is why we have the duty to rehabilitate our culture, to consume it, to develop it constantly. However, it is not a fossilized culture but a living, dynamic culture, where the other is no longer the opposite but the complement. It is, for us today, a culture that has rooted itself in its realities, consolidated itself after taking shape and body, and is open to others to give and receive with dignity. This is all the richness of the generous message carried by the heroic resistance struggle waged by our illustrious African resistors. Ladies and gentlemen, your comrades, your seminar is therefore not a simple confrontation around great deceased figures. It must help us, in reality, to analyze and choose the historical support points allowing us to move forward, with more confidence, towards a happier future for the peoples of Africa, towards true African unity, and towards cooperation between nations, cooperation free from all injustice, all distinctions of color and ideologies, thus tending towards true peace. We thank you for your attention. Ready for the revolution. President Ahmed Sékou Touré, Conakry, November 18, 1982.